All right. Well, Mark, welcome to In Search of Wisdom.
Thank you, Joshua. It's really great to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. I've really enjoyed going through your new book, which we're going to talk about today, Lessons from an American Stoic, how Emerson can change your life. So it's exciting. But before we get into it, we generally start with this, I guess maybe a standard opening question of how you initially came to have an interest in philosophy, Emerson, fill in the blank of what comes to mind there, Mark.
So I went through, so there was a lot of confusion in my childhood. I went through a life and death situation in my 20s, and I was really lucky as a graduate student to come across Emerson's work at a time when I really needed some guidance. I didn't know who he was. I was hired as a research assistant for a professor writing a book about him. And I found in Emerson answers to questions that I didn't even know I had, that I hadn't even quite formulated for myself. He was the first writer I came across who had a sense of what human potential was beyond anything I had come across in my atheistic Jewish background. He was the first transcendental voice that I came across. And he gave me so much hope for what was possible if we start to ask deep questions of ourselves and really pursue the answers down to their root. So that was how it came. That's how it happened for me as a kid. And it has just grown. He's been with me for most of my life. He's seen me through some of the most difficult times that I've gone through. And I feel like he's a kind of guardian angel for me.
Well, beautiful. I'm definitely grateful for the background there and you sharing that. I'm picturing what you write about in the book of this portable Emerson that you have that's all torn up and been with you through the years. Let me ask you maybe it's another standard follow-up question related there around the search piece. You talked about starting very young, this, inward look, journaling and things like that. But it sounds like it's still going today, many decades later. And that is a consistent thing with many of the guests that I've had on. There's some sort of thing that like gets a search that's started and maybe that path is different for everyone, but it's like this lifelong search, if you will. How do you make sense of unending searches, if that's how you see it?
I think life is a practice, it's an ongoing practice of self-discovery. I think that's why we're here. So the idea that we're going to come to the end of the search and somehow, sit back on our laurels and just rest in that, that completed wisdom is a myth. I think we're here to ask questions. We're here to know who we are. As Emerson said, that the unfolding of his nature is the chief end of man. And watching our nature unfold only happens when we're paying attention. And that's something that we cultivate throughout our lives. So I really do think that seekers are a breed unto ourselves. And we tend to be troubled people. We tend to be people with a lot of conflict, people who have intense inner lives, unresolved issues. All of those things that can be problematic in life are actually extremely useful on the seeker's path. Because what you realize is that what wakes you up spiritually may not be what makes you satisfied in any sort of conventional way, emotionally, as a human being. So what feeds you spiritually may be anathema to the ego. So what happens is as life gives you more and more challenges, you realize that there's always spiritual grist for the mill, that these are opportunities for awakening. So it really turns upside down this idea of life as this inalienable pursuit of happiness in a kind of selfish sense. You realize that that's unattainable. But what can be attained is a level of self-awareness and mindfulness and self-mastery that happens by looking at the hard issues and looking at the things that we can't quite resolve. That's where the truth is. It's complex and it's elusive, but it's fascinating. If you're a seeker, it's fascinating. When
Yeah.
students ask me, when am I going to come to the end of all these questions? Why do I have to keep asking the same questions over and over? I tell them because that's the practice of living. That's the craft of living, as Plato called it.
Mm.
The craft of living is based on self-knowledge, which comes through paying attention and asking questions. And that, for seekers, is what makes life interesting.
Yeah. I love it. So great to have you here, Mark. And we generally start with maybe uh, defining some terms and things like that might come up through the um, conversation. One is something you mentioned, transcendentalist or transcendentalism. But before we get to that, for anyone that is not super familiar with Emerson, could you talk a little bit about like the where, when, and why he's an important figure today?
Absolutely. Emerson was our founding philosopher as Americans. He was born in the early 19th century. He lived to almost 80, so his lifespan went across most of the 19th century. And he saw many of the hardest times that we've gone through as a nation. He went through abolition, and he went through slavery. He went through the Civil War, and he was important at a time when the country was really coming to have a sense of itself and its own direction. And he warned against many of the things that we are confronting today. Rampant materialism, losing a spiritual foundation, losing a sense of the transcendent as we were becoming more and more immersed in a capitalist consumer culture. He talked about the importance of transcending tribalism,
Mm.
not being fooled by fake news. A lot of the things that we're struggling with today are things that Emerson prophesied over 150 years ago. So he was a sentinel, really. He was the canary in the philosophical coal mine of American growth and degradation.
Mm.
And so his message of self-reliance is also something that we haven't understood. People have tended to think of self-reliance as rugged individualism, the kind of macho American cowboy John Wayne ideal. But for Emerson, self-reliance was a spiritual path. And this is the one thing I want people to take from my book that has been forgotten. Self-reliance was a spiritual path. He said self-reliance is reliance on God, however you define God. He said there's nothing so weak as an egotist. So he was really going against the whole trend toward self-aggrandizement, selfishness, competition, looking at ourselves as a country above other countries. All of that was anathema to Emerson. As a transcendentalist, he really spoke to the unity of being, the unity of humankind. And that's something that we need desperately in our public discourse today. We've lost all sense of the commonality and our shared interest in preserving life on the planet and preserving a sense of decorum and public decency. We've lost so much of that today. That's exactly what he cared about most. He cared about the unfolding of the individual and the greatness that is inherent in each of us. He spoke about the infinitude of the private man, that each of us has this territory inside us that is much bigger than our personality and our little picture of the little me. So what transcendentalism is about is cultivating a more direct relationship with the divine or with the metaphysical, however you define that. And finding that very often through nature. That was one of his great themes, along with Thoreau, his protege, was that nature is our greatest teacher. And so by returning to our connection to nature, we discover, we rediscover, we remember our own origins.